Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today's episode kicks off a new format that I think I'll be doing from time to time with my friend Ben Kintisch, who is a hospice chaplain, music teacher, but also the creator of Life Review, the hospice musical. And so we are going to be discussing death, dying, and grief in pop culture. And we're starting out today by talking about the Broadway musical Dear Evan Hansen. And we'll have future conversations that go in lots of different directions. And we have lots of fun talking with each other. So stay tuned. I think you'll enjoy this. If you haven't already, be sure and subscribe using the button down below. Also, subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen on any platform. And go to eoluniversity.com/support if you're able to make a small contribution that will help keep this show and the podcast on the air. So thanks in advance. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Ben Kintisch. Today, I'm so excited to welcome back my return guest, Benjamin Kintisch. Ben is now my friend. He last came on the podcast, it's 3.5 years ago, and we've been able to stay in touch with each other and kind of follow each other's work ever since then. But I'm so excited that he's back again. We're going to talk some more. I'll tell you just briefly a little bit about Ben, because some of you may not remember him from that long ago. Ben is a cantor, a hospice and elder care chaplain, and a music teacher, in addition to his involvement with theater and songwriting. He is the creator of Life Review, the hospice musical, his first musical. And in our first podcast, we talked all about the musical. Ben sang some songs for us. We even went on to do a workshop where he sang more songs, and we had a great audience for that online. Really exciting. And you can
Yes,
learn
a
more.
highlight of my COVID tour,
It,
by the way.
all right. Yes, it was part of this was during the COVID days when everything was
Yeah.
online, and it was so exciting to be able to actually present a live event
Yes.
over
Still
Zoom.
grateful to you for that, Karen. It's one of my I'm no joking here for all the listeners. Karen is not just a great podcast host, but a booster of the arts. She was a fabulous producer and friend for that event. And so I want to thank you in front of all of your listeners, Karen, that you put on that event. It was super successful, and it kind of became a proof of concept that my little show that could, while churning along and trying to find its bigger commercial stages, might have some interesting appearances and interesting possibilities in a charitable appearance setting, in a benefit concert setting, and in a workshop or clinical setting. So, in a sense, the virtual concert that you hosted for some of those fans from your End of Life University podcast listener world, uh, that was a very self selected audience, but boy, were they engaged. We had a great conversation to follow. And we were proud to raise several $100 in donation funds that we gave to Denver Hospice, right? Which was your
Yeah.
chosen charity. So that was awesome. And I've since, performed it for lots of different groups. Um, but what's been fun about our ongoing relationship, it's not just through the social media stuff, but we kind of have listened to some of each other's appearances on our shows, various appearances. So when you and I connected over the phone recently, we were talking about how you wanted to try some new stuff with End of Life University. So maybe this would be a cool time to share with the listeners what what you were thinking about that, and why you brought your old friend Ben in.
Yeah, I've been thinking I'm just always looking for something new to talk about. And here's a confession. I'm an avid podcast listener, but I do not listen to podcasts about end of life issues. I listen a lot to reality TV podcasts. And it started
Oh,
occurring to me that
the doctor does lowbrow.
yeah, but I don't watch the reality TV shows. I listen to podcasts about the shows, which is so it's like one step removed. I don't know why, but it's fascinating to me. And what I keep recognizing is there is grief everywhere in every story, and in these reality TV shows, every
Mm-hmm.
one of those casts could use a grief counselor, because a lot of the people who are functioning poorly in the shows, I can see it. They have a history of grief that never got addressed. Anyway, so I'm applying what I know and think about to listening to these shows. And it made me think, I really want to do more of a dive into popular culture and how death and dying and grief show up in popular culture right now, because we constantly say our society doesn't talk about grief, our society doesn't make room for death and dying, but I'm finding it everywhere. As
Me
when
too.
I watch a series on Netflix, there's grief, there's death and dying.
Mm-hmm.
I watch movies, everything I see now, I'm seeing lots of death and dying and grief being shown, and I think that's positive. I don't know if it's entirely new or if I just didn't recognize it before, but I realized I kind of want to talk about that, but I need somebody to talk about it with. And my first thought is I want to talk about death and dying in Broadway musicals, and who would know about that but my friend Ben, who
A
we can
hundred percent.
kick this off by
Yes.
talking about how death and dying show up in musicals. I mean, Life Review, the Hospice musical, is an obvious example of that. But I,
Yes.
I think
Not
there's,
yet Broadway, Karen, but from your mouth to
yes,
God's feminine
it's a,
ears, may
it's
it
a,
be Broadway someday.
it's a future Broadway musical.
Future Broadway musical. Oh, I like that.
Let's
Just put
say
that out in the
that.
world. Let's say that.
Yes,
But
yes.
when I chose that difficult subject, I sometimes have to defend it. When I'm doing my elevator pitch and I see the person's face, maybe I think you and I have shared and laughed about how a guy who does a musical about death and dying in a hospice setting, a professional who's a doctor in the death dying space, we both get all kinds of awkward faces and reactions when we tell people what we do, right? And I like to offer to people that there is a lot of laughter in the show. There is hope and healing, as well as, of course, some power ballads that make us cry. And I would contend, in terms of what you said earlier about pop culture, just look at movies. I just the other night I said to my wife we should go to the movies, and we looked at, to be fair, some rather disappointing offerings at the local multiplex. But let's even look at what they had. We can, whether you like or not the ascendance of the so-called comic book movies, right? The superhero movies. What does every single superhero movie have? It has one, if not four, big death and dying scenes. Sometimes it's a flashback, the moment his dad died and gave him the superpowers in a nest of magic beans or stones or whatever. Sorry, I'm confusing musical theater and comic books there. But you get the idea. It's central, right? Every superhero movie must have one or more death and dying scenes. And just to kind of make the obvious meta point, every life story is going to have death and dying in it. Whether we see a story beyond the let's call it first person narrative, right? If the narrative goes with the consciousness of the narrator, then maybe we can't see beyond the birth and the death. But if we're outside of that person, we can see that person's birth and we can even see his funeral. And that could be the biggest possible span. But as we look at any other person's life as a Hollywood movie, so to speak, we understand implicitly like this movie is going to be a tearjerker, right? You know that when you do a Hollywood biopic, especially if it's someone who has died. Like I recently saw the Elvis movie. I mean,
Hmm.
I cry for all kinds of movies, extra for rock stars who die. But like, oh man, I was weeping and I knew how that thing ended. I don't know. Do you cry at movies too, Karen?
Yes, I cry at commercials on television. But
Oh
I
wow, that's
mean,
next
I cry
level.
pretty easily. Yeah.
Just yesterday, I was interviewed on a podcast where they asked me a question and tell me if you've been asked the same. Basically, Ben, you used to work as a hospice chaplain. I imagine that must be so difficult. How did you do that? And I sort of answered it on two levels. One, the techniques I use to kind of navigate the emotional challenges, and more meta, like, why am I suited as a personality? So, that bigger question, I said, I've always been a feeling person. I cry at movies, I cry at sappy TV shows. And I said, I think being able to access those feelings in certain settings is considered like socially taboo, but in certain kinds of healing settings, it's a very useful skill, so that you can ride the emotional wave of other people and not drown. Thoughts, Dr. Wyatt?
Oh, I think that's so true. And I think, I mean, those of us who get into the work who maybe didn't have well-developed skills in that area, you learn it rather quickly when you sit at the bedside of people who are going through serious illness or even dying, and
Yep.
you learn it sometimes by just observing them because they're on this journey of a lifetime. They themselves are having to learn how do you navigate it, and how do you still find joy and love and humor in your life. And just by sitting
Mm.
with them, you get better and better at finding that place yourself.
Oh, absolutely. I was describing the hundreds of hours one does to get the chaplaincy certification. So I've done 4 units of CPE, which I believe is 1,200 hours of supervised clinical visits. So that's probably approximately 300 individual visits per unit, possibly more. Because some visits, if the person doesn't speak, you don't want to do longer than 30 minutes sitting next to a nonverbal person. It's just, it goes from spiritual to challenging and even a little spooky. So you like, you keep it tight. When a person can talk, maybe you go a little longer, but there's even a wisdom that you don't, or a recommendation that you don't want to push it too long, because they're fun to talk to. They might be expending too much energy to entertain the chaplain or the doctor. I bet you have that problem too, because you're nice. So people are like, "Can I talk to you a little longer, doctor?" And you're like, "Okay."
Oh yeah. That was my problem throughout my whole medical practice of
Called it.
going overtime because I also like I just wanted to hear more of the story. If people were
Mm-hmm.
telling me something like, wait, okay, I'm 10 minutes behind, but I gotta finish. You gotta finish this story. I need to hear it because I love stories so much.
Yeah, I think that's why you became an instant super fan for my musical, because it's all built around taking those stories heard bedside, turning them into songs. Um, we, as practitioners, or let's call it caregivers in the hospice space, are privy to some very holy and important private moments that the quote general public don't see. So we can talk about some big ideas in terms of our stories, but a lot of the experiences feel rather private and rather, um, not small in a diminutive way, but still, they are small moments that are the important moments. And I think, but for art, and in the case of our budding conversation, theater, film, and music, I think those are the three pillars of our cultural conversation. We're going to be exploring together how theater, including aforementioned the Ben Kintisch Life Review Hospice musical. Oh no, I put my name up front. That was vainglorious. No, but theater in general, different ones that deal with death and dying. We're going to talk about music, selecting albums that deal heavily on that theme and in useful ways, if not individual songs. And then the last group, we wanted to avoid books, was films. And the other format that you and I came upon, which I want to share with our listeners, Karen, in the model of the dearly departed but quite wonderful, um, we today we laughed and learned. Look it up on the internet. It's still listenable, just no new episodes. Great show with two good friends who are very funny, and they took turns teaching each other on kind of random topics. Um, Really fun format, and the taking turns helps because you don't have to do your homework every week. So Karen and I will be taking turns on who is presenting as the lead presenter, and hopefully the combination of taking turns and rotating through different topics will be fun for you listeners. Again, theater about death and dying, movies about death and dying, and ah, music.
Music.
Music about death and dying. And I think for our inaugural episode together, we're going to do musical theater. Am I right?
That's right. And I wanted to add to this to say one of the reasons I think this is important. We talk a lot about increasing death literacy in our society, like helping people
Yes.
know how to talk about death and get more comfortable talking about death. And I think pop culture is a really good lens through which to view death and talk about it, because you can talk to your friends about the musical you saw, about the movie you loved. And if you get comfortable noticing where death shows up and where grief is actually a character in the plot, it gives you a doorway through which you can start to have some of these challenging conversations with people. And you're not having to talk about your own life or their life. You're talking about characters in a play or in a movie. And I just think it's one of the ways we can help people increase their death literacy.
I was nodding through 100% of that. Um, Sometimes when I explain my show as a way to loop it into the existing creative literature, I say my main character is an orphan, like most of the Disney heroes. And that often like brings a conversation to the person being like, "Oh yeah, Belle's mother is gone, and in Frozen, both of the parents die in a shipwreck, and blah 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 blah." And um, it's an interesting conversation for children, tweens, and adults, right? To kind of acknowledge that so much of it's not just the Disney and the animated movie literature, but it's just kind of a trope in um, I'm just going to call it youth literature, however you imagine it. The family that's a little bit torn asunder, if not fully broken. And I believe I'm not inventing this next idea here, just repeating it, hopefully with some coherence. I believe the point is that we all have a universal fear of losing our parents. So when the hero is an orphan, it's some sort of acknowledgement of that fear and some sort of engaging with it. Because
So true.
statistically, I don't think there's as many orphans in real life as the pop culture statistics
That's
might
the,
suggest.
yeah.
but it's a thing that I did also as a device because it turns out that this youngish chaplain guy has his own grief issues. So guy in his 40s with two dead parents, one can safely assume he's got grief stuff, right? I mean, you don't even need to ask anything more. Um, so that became a little bit of a plot device or a shorthand. Also, I should mention that in the opening scene, he's on his knees planting bulbs in a garden, kind of in memorial of his mother, knowing that they will come up in spring
Mm,
in memory of the deceased parents. He describes it as a floral yahrzeit, like an yahrzeit is a Jewish anniversary of a death.
mm.
So a certain kind of a natural anniversary of this death, but in a hopeful kind of way. Um, in terms of theater, one of the ones I think we're going to talk about, I don't know if we're doing it tonight or in a future episode, is Dear Evan Hansen. And that idea of the bulbs coming up as a visual symbol of hope, I included that as a visual hat tip to Dear Evan Hansen because at the last scene of Dear Evan Hansen, there's some tiny trees like pretend saplings that come out of the floor or are simulated in some kind of way, depending upon the stage you have. Um, it's meant to be a visual of their planting an orchard slash arboretum. I don't know, some sort of natural space in memory of the kid who died earlier in the play. And this feels hopeful.
Yeah. Well, I chose to start with musical theater. First of all, thinking about you and your expertise. again, as the creator of the future Broadway hit Life Review, the Hospice musical. But because I don't know very much about Broadway, I haven't, I live in the West. I've gone there a few times. I've seen a few musicals there on Broadway, but also seen them in other venues too. So I wanted somebody else who knows a little bit more about this genre to talk to about with. But most recently, my most recent trip to New York, which has been, gosh, it was pre-COVID actually, I had the pleasure of seeing Dear Evan Hansen and Hamilton both on that trip. And so I chose those two musicals because I've seen them both and I know
Good.
something about them. And I was so deeply moved by both of them. And it was the grief and the
Yep.
death as a character in a sense that really touched me, and I've never stopped thinking about them, and it just showed me the power of this medium on stage, visual auditory medium, the power it has over kind of opening our hearts and our minds and teaching us things. And that so I really so that's why I chose those two musicals to talk about, because
Nice.
and if we don't get through both of them, I mean, we're going to have other conversations. So we'll
I can definitely
later, but
cover both of them in one show. I'll just have to promise to do highlights, not attempt to recite the entire libretto of both, because that second choice won't fit, right?
yeah.
Um, but they are both great shows. And before we go into the specifics, I want to acknowledge what you said in terms of theater and its power to open our hearts. Um, I am a big fan of theater like yourself. As a theater maker, one of my intentions since getting involved with the creation of Life Review, I'm going to say like 5 years into the project, even, I said out loud to my wife and other friends, my two main composers on the team, as an intention. I said, I want to start seeing more theater, full stop. And then the reason being was multifaceted. One, to inspire me, two, to entertain me, and then three, to broaden my horizons for the possibilities of what people can do on this little rectangle that we look at in the dark with the lights shining on the people. When you really drill down into what theater actually is, its essential elements are rather simple. And I'm kind of bracketing away the avant-garde world. That's amazing too, and that's a different subset of theater. But if we're thinking about so-called conventional musical theater, it has to literally exist in a box
Hmm.
called a commercial Broadway theater. And how they use the box and how they present things are different. Hamilton did some cool stuff with the turntable. Dear Evan Hansen did some really breathtaking stuff with projections and visuals that kind of gave us an idea of all the internet culture that was part of the social media subplot of the play. Um, but you are correct that for both of them, while being very fresh and new, they have some timeless themes and rather universal themes. For Dear Evan Hansen, I've always described it as a musical about loneliness and about desperate acts related to wanting to fit in. Hamilton, I would describe more as an epic biographical tale featuring um, amazing triumphs and staggering heartbreaks of Alexander Hamilton. But that those sort of the acknowledgement of the ups and downs, I feel, are important when explaining what Hamilton is, and that, of course, sidesteps all of the spectacular artistry and the virtuosity of Lin Manuel Miranda's words and music. Like, a spectacular piece of work. But for what you and I are talking about, I think both of the plays have in common, in specific, is how beautifully they handle um, the ups and downs of life, but especially the downs as they pertain to love and loss. So I think I want to give maybe some highlights of how both plays deal with it, and then maybe we can have some back and forth. Does that sound good?
Okay, that sounds
All
good.
right, cool. So I'm just to challenge myself, folks. I am historically long-winded. Fun fact: last night, for the fifth time in history, I was told by a podcast host, "Wow, Ben, you talk so long. We're gonna make this a two-parter." I shit you not. And bleep that as necessary. Okay. I fool you not. Um, I talk a long time. Okay, 1 minute to do all of Hamilton and all of the love and loss. Here we go. Opening number, we hear that Hamilton, the main character, is an orphan. He's called as such throughout the play. So the absence of his family, specifically his father, looms large throughout. When he seeks father figures, including George Washington, it's to replace that major absence. Um, he lives an exciting life, but he also loses heroically. When he has a sex scandal, his dream of becoming the president is lost, so he has to deal with that kind of grief. When his son dies in a duel, his heart is broken, and when he himself is struck down early in his life, I think at the ripe old age of 40 or so, his wife takes center stage, grieving the loss of her husband. Thus, grief in Hamilton and scene. That was 60 seconds. How did I do?
You covered it, but there's
Okay.
just so much depth
And
you
there's
could go
more,
into.
but I ran out of time.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Okay.
And it's a 3.5 hour show. And I'm going to do the same for Dear Evan Hansen, and then we can talk
Okay.
again.
Okay.
Ready? 60 seconds on the clock. Grief, death, and diving. Um, in Dear Evan Hansen, here we go. 1 minute on the clock. Dear Evan Hansen tells the tale of a sad, lonely boy named Evan Hansen who writes the letter as an exercise from a therapist. He is depressed and lonely, and it turns out he had a chance encounter with a boy who would go on to commit suicide off stage. Evan concocts a story in an act of desperate loneliness, claiming he was friends with the dead boy, and his life becomes exciting, all built on a lie. Everything goes terribly well until it goes terribly bad. And we discover that grieving people are susceptible to scams and interlopers. Sometimes people fall in love in ways they don't want to when they're grieving. All of this happens in a fast moving and, I would say, emotional whirlwind. Dear Evan Hansen, an amazing play about grief, love, and loss, not to be missed.
Hmm.
And time.
Wow.
I did it.
You summed those up.
Thank you.
That's
All
pretty
right, Dr.
amazing.
Wyatt. Let's hear your no, I'm only gonna say Dr. Wyatt when I'm insisting on especially smart commentary. If I say Karen, we're just, no one's listening, okay?
Oh,
So
okay.
which
Well, now I
answer do you
know.
prefer? Dr. Wyatt or Karen? How about Karen?
Okay, just
Karen, thinking
I'll just be
back to
Karen.
here, we'll go with the tiers index for which one do you want to tackle first? Of the two shows you saw live in New York, which
Hmm.
one made you cry more? I'm guessing Dear Evan Hansen because you're a parent, but
Yeah,
am I
dear
right?
dear Evan Hansen, personally, yeah, because my father died by suicide, and so
Oh,
it,
Jesus.
yeah.
Sorry for that, but
No,
please
but
continue.
that's, I mean, that's important, because that's one of the things that happens when we watch these plays and movies. It brings up our own grief, it brings up our own pain that we're carrying, which is one of the reasons it's just so profound. And so to be able to witness this family dealing with a suicide death, the guilt that people felt, the questions, the
Ugh.
uncertainty of why did this happen? And I completely related in every way to it. And I also understood why, when this boy, Evan Hansen, came into their lives, who actually didn't know their son, but for his own reasons was claiming to, it felt, oh, fantastic. Our son had this friend. And it felt like something they desperately
So sad.
wanted, like someone who knew him or got a letter from him or had some information about their son.
Mm,
And they were so desperate for it.
yeah.
And
All of a
Ev-
sudden he was alive again.
he
That
was
boy
alive again,
lived.
and Evan was desperate to be needed by someone, and they needed
Mm,
him in that moment. And you could see tragically how they came together, and maybe in some ways in the end they ended up actually saving each other, even though it was horrible and painful to get through the deception and come out on the other side. But
yes.
um, maybe Evan might have died the same way their son did had he not had this opportunity to feel like he could make a difference or he could do something that might help other people.
Wow, that's an incredibly deep read of the show.
You asked for
I
Dr.
never
Wyatt.
said it.
Yeah, it's
Yes, you did it. You earned the D, the R, and the dot, all three letters. Um, I want to react to what you said. I think as I heard you kind of going a little bit deeper into the suicide aspects of the play, I realized that I did not say that word in my 60-second. I mean, maybe I did. I say a kid
you
who died
did.
by suicide.
Yeah, you
Um,
did.
but there's an important extra subtext that didn't fit in the 60-second version that I think is important to highlight. As we get to know Evan, it becomes more and more ambiguous as to whether his broken arm was an accident or a suicide attempt. Gone, I don't know. I guess you call it attempt shows that he lived, right, as opposed to a
Yeah.
completion, right? So, but that question is not sharpened until later in the play, which is a very effective device because early in the play, we get the sense he's a lonely, awkward boy, but we don't understand how deep is his pain until some of these gut punch, heart ripping. I mean, I can't think of all the cliches to describe the songs late in the play that he sings. Love, Words Fail is the big one. It's sort of his it's sort of his apology song when the lie comes out. So for you folks listening at home, if you're we recommend, we don't have the rights to play the songs on the air, but whether you listen to whatever way you listen to the music, we recommend you access both soundtracks, Dear Evan Hansen and Hamilton. But for reference, the song I'm currently talking about is called Words Fail, and it happens at the end of the show, and he's basically saying that he is so devastated and ashamed and broken in what he has done, he doesn't even know how to say sorry. Which I think is very relatable for that moment, your most shameful f up in your life, whatever it was, and you couldn't even apologize. You were so embarrassed or ashamed. That is a very powerful moment for what he did. Um, and I also think he's he's torn asunder by his own brokenness, right? Like
Hmm.
I was hearing you describe his desperation, the family desperate to believe the lie, everyone desperate because the suicide had broken. Like that's really the subtext. All of this behavior that doesn't make sense at first, it starts to make sense when we start to pay attention to the mess that the suicide had left in the family, resulting in, as we clinicians might just name it, complicated grief. There's
Hmm.
another song called Requiem, which I once spoke about at a conference, and I did a little presentation about songs about grief, and I included this one. Um, so each verse is a different member of the ensemble cast doing their riff on the word requiem. So historically, of course, requiem is a death song from a funeral rite. Right,
Hmm.
that's what
Hmm.
it means in like Grove's Dictionary of Music, like Mozart's Requiem played at a big funeral. um, so the hook in the song is "I will sing no requiem." So a couple of the players sing "I will sing no requiem" because they're so angry at the boy who died by suicide, because it's a selfish act, because it's an act that metaphorically splashes the blood on all of the survivors. I've heard said, um, it's
Hmm.
in a certain sense, it's outrageous what you have done to your family when you choose to end your life. And so several people in the song express that. Another person just is basically like, you were a jerk when you were alive, so I'm not going to mourn you,
Mm.
which I think is possibly the best succinct explanation of complicated grief ever seen in pop culture. Um, it's because that term is a thorny one, and people always would come to me in my chaplain and cantor role. Karen, I did a lot of funerals. People ask, how did you become a chaplain? Basically, I did so many funerals, I thought I needed more training to do it better, and chaplaincy certainly served me well. But even before I was trained, I noticed people came to me and they would apologize for not feeling the right way. Did you ever get this as doctor?
Yes. Yes.
And the apology is basically, I'm feeling any way but what I perceive, I'm guessing, from a so called Hallmark movie. But even that is a fallacy, because as soon as you pay attention to movies, and maybe that'll be part of what we elucidate here in these conversations, as soon as you pay attention to those so called Hollywood movies and those Broadway plays and those, you know, professional music recordings, there is no Hollywood treatment or no typical treatment of death and dying. We just have a kind of conventional wisdom. I'm guessing it means a so-called peaceful death. Maybe it means all the family is gathered and all of the historic wrongs are righted. All of the things that need to be said are said. What else am I missing here, Karen?
Well, I just wanted to say how important this point is, that through this medium of theater and story, we can present these really hard truths that grief is a mixed bag of emotion, including anger, and including
Yeah,
blame, including guilt, including a lot of negative feelings
hurt.
that we feel embarrassed to have. We're also afraid to admit to other people that we feel that when we're grieving, because we think we're only supposed to be sad
Mm,
that our loved one has died. And so the fact that they could show this range of emotion through one song,
yep.
Requiem, it's really powerful to see that displayed.
Yeah, I remember. I'm thinking, my wife and I saw this show on Broadway with the original cast before it won the Tonys, which meant we got some decent seats for not a fortune, and we, yes, got to see young Ben Platt when he still looked high school age. I'm not going to address the Hollywood controversy. Y'all can blow up the comments later. Um, Let me just say with acknowledgement, I hope I someday get to be on a Hollywood screen. I just know not to try to play high school at this point. Um, so I digress, but it was an incredible show, and I remember crying openly during Requiem because it um there's a wisdom I once learned in chaplaincy training, Karen, where they said every funeral reminds you of every funeral. Have you ever heard that said?
That's so true. Very true.
And for all of you good listeners and viewers, think about the last time you went to a funeral, whether it was someone close, like a spouse, a parent, God forbid, a child, sibling, friend. You probably experienced that moment in all of your intense grief. And then at some point, when someone was going on too long, the sermon that was long winded or the awkward story that could have been edited, you probably went to another funeral. Maybe your first funeral, like the funeral of a grandparent, or the backyard burial of a beloved childhood pet. Maybe if you hate the church and you had to sit through a church, you were wrestling with that thorny personal stuff. If you're Jewish or Muslim and you had to sit in a house of a different faith or your own faith, whatever it is, like we know, there's a lot of faith stuff that we have to deal with. And of course, as alluded to with that song, if you have have or had a complicated relationship with the deceased, there's a good chance that you had or have some unresolved stuff. Speaking for myself, um, you know, I have been to some funerals and memorial services for people I care deeply about, where I had a decent relationship but hadn't had a quote important final conversation. You know, I just heard that they died and I was sad. And there was definitely that feeling of like, oh boy, I wish I could have dot dot dot. And it wasn't even like I was estranged. So that is to say, I've not personally had the experience, Karen, of burying someone under the experience of estrangement. However, I have, as cantor and chaplain, engaged with a lot of people who, at a funeral, have come to me saying, "Hey, cantor, that's my grandpa. He and I got in a fight 10 years ago." Or worse yet, that's my dad. He and I got in a fight 30 years ago. It is not uncommon. Like at almost the exception to the rule would be a funeral where no one says that to me. That's how common it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. And
And it got me thinking about how just last thought on that, just like how common the fact of estrangement is in American families. I don't know about the rest of the world, and how sad it is to me that people choose that as opposed to the choice to attempt for peacemaking and reconciliation. Your thoughts?
yeah, I agree with you. I think that is very common. And actually one of the things I loved about hospice work is because it's a situation where the person is usually dying we gradually or more slowly, there's a little space in time when there's an opportunity if someone who's been estranged could come back, could have the conversation, could resolve things if they chose to. and
Yes.
and I highly encouraged that and still do, like that
Yep.
is so transformative if you're able to be part of that experience versus when someone dies suddenly and unexpectedly, that opportunity is taken away and you don't
Yep.
have that um that that's I guess the part I want to emphasize. There can be amazing resolutions to old resentment and bitterness if people have the courage to show up when a loved one is going through their last weeks of life, but a lot of people don't have
Yep.
the courage or don't take that step.
You know, I try to tell people that my musical is not meant to be didactic, giving lessons and so forth. But if there is a lesson that I bring to my appearances, it's please, if you have a loved one of whatever generation in acute care, be it hospital, nursing care, even assisted living, elder care, hospice for sure, make the visit in person. If that makes you nervous, we promise you won't catch dying or getting old. But if you're scared of it, you can use the technology. You can do FaceTime. Most of us have these smartphones. It's the exception to the rule, people who don't have a smartphone now, over 18 or 12. So that means we can all do video easily. So there's really no excuse, um, but for our deep discomfort with the fact that someone we love is dying or sick. But here's the thing, while acknowledging that it's terrible and painful and uncomfortable, when we choose to engage to make that visit in person or even virtually, as you and I are doing today, we can connect and make a nice connection. Um, One of the COVID keepers, as it were, things we learned from COVID that we want to keep going, is the power of connection mitigated through the screen or enabled by the screens. We were able to become quickly accustomed to almost universal adoption of virtual care for basic, like primary care providers. Karen, you're a former doctor. Wasn't that crazy?
Yeah, yeah, it was
A hundred
amazing.
percent of Americans at one point, if they wanted a doctor, they did it through their phone, which used to be fantasy like the Jetsons.
Exactly. Far off in the future. And it happened. It was amazing.
Okay, and I want to say in a moment of radical sharing to show you what kind of co-host I'm going to be, the first time, and I promise this is almost family appropriate. The first time I engaged in medical care through a phone, I showed a doctor an unnamed embarrassing part of my body. I'll just leave it there to your good imagination. I kept it
Okay.
family friendly, but it was mortifying. And my wife was like, "Sweetie, he's a doctor. He looks at everyone's parts. Like not like literally nothing embarrasses him."
That is true.
Um,
That's true.
I mean, can you vouch for that, Karen? Have you seen all kinds of parts of all kinds of
Yes.
people?
All kinds of parts, and they get very boring. And so
And like nothing is either sexy or embarrassing anymore, at least
that's
not in the
right.
condition you see it.
That's right.
I'm sure there
That's
are things that you, or I would actually, I can't be sure for your sexuality, but I would say, I imagine that there's still beautiful people in beautiful bodies in various beautiful or sexy situations that arouse you, but that's very different from meeting bodies in a clinical setting. Am I right?
I can't believe we're I can't believe we're talking about this on the
Well,
podcast. It
it's
was
important
a segue.
because
Yep.
wait, where did it get? Where did we get here? Was it one of our songs? Hmm.
Uh, COVID, connecting,
Oh no, no, no. Doctors,
telehealth,
yes.
telehealth.
Yes, so there was an embarrassing moment when an embarrassing part got shown. Anyway, but here's the thing. To keep it G-rated again, let's keep our clothes on, people, keep the camera above the waist. Um, we can engage very closely in a clinical way like therapists and doctors doing entertainment, and it's very exciting for making this stuff possible. And I hope for conversations like ours to be a bit more engaging in that we have the camera and all that connectivity. So,
Yeah.
see, I brought it back.
All
I brought
right.
it back.
All right.
Now,
You pulled it in. Okay.
I pulled it
Well,
in literally and put it away, zipped it up. Karen, let me ask you something about Dear Evan Hansen. You mentioned the thing about suicide, and I don't need you to go any further than you're comfortable with, but one thing that's been brought to me as a playwright who has chosen a difficult subject, I did hospice care and by extension death and dying. We're talking about Dear Evan Hansen, and one of its central themes is the, shall we call it, the turmoil that occurs in the wake of a suicide. Is that
mhm.
fair?
Yes.
So as a suicide survivor, how did you feel that show did? How was it successful? Was it authentic? How did it feel for you as an audience member with your
Yeah.
vantage point?
Yeah. I mean, I thought based on my own personal experience, it seemed authentic. I found myself relating. I mean, it was my father who died by suicide, not a child, which would
Right.
be, you know, even more devastating, of course, in its own way. But um, the reactions of the family, the ups and downs, I it really it felt authentic to me in that here we are. I mean, I'm attending a musical and attending my father's funeral at the same time as you were describing. You know, I'm attending the musical, I'm attending my own experience of grief in the
Mm.
midst of that musical. I think that's why it had such an effect on me is because it was done well and it rang true for me.
Wow. That last thing you said bears repeating. I was attending the musical and I was attending my father's funeral. Um, that's there we have it, the transformative moment.
Yeah.
To take your seat and bring you to a different time and place.
Yeah. But and while we're talking about this musical, I mean, I want to emphasize to people that it isn't it probably sounds like, oh my God, who would ever want to go see that? It sounds
Oh, it's
it sounds
totally
so
uplifting.
painful.
It's not
But
a
it's
bummer.
yeah, it's uplifting and you mentioned the trees growing at the end
Very
and
hopeful, especially
that
as it wraps.
is that is also something that rang true for me, is to be able to dive deep into my own grief, feel it. It was uh what do I want to say? It was like a catalyst for going back into my grief and kind of opening that up. But then to
Mhm.
have the ending and to feel kind of the redemption and the healing that took place, and the trees growing that you mentioned at the end, it was wow. It was just a full experience of all of these emotions, but left, as you said, in a very up left me in an uplifted state at the end. So I just want people to know that. Don't worry that you're going to walk out of there
Mhm.
completely devastated and feeling like you
Okay,
just had
I'm
the worst
pointing.
night of your life.
First tears, first episode. Your co-host is officially crying on camera.
Oh.
Um, I was thinking about the power of Dear Evan Hansen when I saw it on stage. I think I've also been thinking a lot about my friend Pete, who is my closest friend, who died um, over a decade ago, but he was in his 30s. He had muscular dystrophy, which doesn't diminish the pain of his loss. It's just less shocking. This is I'm not explaining for you, but for your listeners' benefit, a degenerative disease that usually reduces lifespan dramatically for its young men who die age 10 through 40 to max. I mean, he made it to age 30, had a family and a master's and did amazing stuff, but still devastating when he died. I think about him a lot. And you know, he I saw him for the last visit when he was at the hospital, and I could tell this is going to be his last hospitalization. I don't think his family realized it, but I saw it. And um it was a time when I had begun actively writing the project, but it was early in the show. And I was noticing, Karen, um, the rawness that I was trying to lean into. This may be surprising because I know earlier when we were chatting, we were making light a little bit about the kind of emotional profile one might like to have to be a good end of life physician or musical writer. But the flip side of it, the lightheartedness, is also accessing the tears and so forth. And I I feel like there was a lot of there was a lot of tears. Like, I think I should name it here. There was a lot of tears in my hospice training, for sure. I remember someone asked me recently in an interview, was it hard to be a hospice chaplain? And I'm like, yeah, because everyone I met was either dying or their loved one was. That's heavy. Like, there's no way around that. That's challenging. Now, like, if you are psychologically relatively balanced, if you're in therapy, if you have, positive and lively hobbies beyond the walls of the hospice, that all helps, right? But the work itself is challenging, but not undoable, because I think the flip side of that coin for me, and tell me if you relate here, was the sort of surprising moments of spectacular optimism or over the top gratitude.
Mhm.
Again, not from every patient, and not in an expected or predictable way. That's
Mhm.
why, like, you don't go into hospice care or any related tough medical field. You don't do pediatric cancer for the thank you cards. You will get moving thank you cards from the patients whose kids die and whose kids survive, but that's not why you do pediatric cancer care. But you have to be able to ride a lot of intense emotions or you can't do it.
Mhm.
And in a sense, part of what makes the choice to engage with this stuff through theater pop culture is the regular public, the people who might listen to our show, who aren't necessarily working in the trenches, so to speak, all the time. They can visit for a tolerable amount. I've sometimes had my daughter say, "Why do you like sad songs so much?" And I'm like, "Sad songs are amazing because you can hurt for 3.5 minutes and then wipe your eyes." and you usually feel better. Or if you really need it, put it on repeat and like as my wife used to laugh about certain Indigo Girls songs, like she calls it her lie on the floor and cry music. Not all of their songs, but many of them have a certain melancholy heaviness. They're beautiful and sad. Um, but they also, there's a lot of power that comes out of you when you cry, and it feels
Mhm.
good. So to me, that's kind of my general recommendation for crying in reaction to art. So if, dear listeners and viewers, as you watch our recommendations, you find yourself crying more than usual, you're doing it right. Am I right, Doctor?
Exactly, exactly. Don't hesitate to see Dear Evan Hansen, let it move you and affect you, and then think about it, process it, but also talk about it with other people, because what a great way to bring up these difficult topics, but to discuss it through the lens of a character in a musical.
Absolutely. And for your reference, dear listeners and viewers, Dear Evan Hansen is available in a highly recommended original Broadway cast. There has been a controversial film version. You can choose to view it, but viewer discretion is advised for all the reasons the internet will explain, mostly having to do with a person who is not high school age playing high school. But nonetheless, if you can get past that detail, I found it to be a moving film. Again, a lot of people couldn't get past Ben Platt's age as he played a kid 12 years younger than him. Um, do you want to do Hamilton? I can do it quick and dirty, or if you think we're already at time, we do it
I
next time.
I
What
think
do
we
you
should
say,
save
co-host?
it. I think we should save it
All
for
right.
next time so we don't feel like we have to rush through it.
Well, that's
And
fine. So we can tell our listeners that we will do Hamilton the next time we talk theater, and I can watch or listen one more time in advance. I
yeah,
feel like I'm more fluent with Dear Evan Hansen, and if we're not rushing off it, I want to say that one of the things about the show that I believe is so powerful as a theater lover is it is it's tight. Um, it's sung through, meaning no spoken dialogue, all songs, all music. And the way I've seen it presented, and I think I've only seen it done twice on stage, once on Broadway and once in regional theater, both professional to my mind and eye and ear. Um, it's done typically with a ton of movement and a lot of visuals, including projections. So if there's a moment in a so-called conventional show when you might stop and reflect, Dear Evan Hansen does not give you that moment.
that's true.
Um, that's not a critique, but just an observation, because there are a lot of plays that deal with death and dying that are more well known. I'll give you an example without explaining it, just alluding to it. Angels in America, the Tony Kushner masterpiece, won the Pulitzer Prize. I believe that's two full length plays, approximately 5 or 6 hours in
Mm.
duration. I've never seen it on stage, but I've read portions. It's intense. Several famous German operas run 4 or 5 hours, and they often have this sort of grandiose narrative style where they span not just one life, but sometimes generations, meaning multiple lives that grow and end. So, to return to our opening kind of meta conversation, acknowledging what you and I agree upon, which I guess
Mhm.
is the premise of this kind of co-hosting conversation, is that death and dying is very much all around us in our pop culture, um, and hopefully looking at it, listening to it, watching it with more engagement will be useful for us through the lenses of theater, screen, and music. And we'll have a conversation together.
Yes.
Hopefully, you'll enjoy it. And let me invite our listeners as we launch this new format, this new series, however we're doing it. Could you guys put in the comments some musicals, since we started with that, some musicals which you like or even love that you think we should talk about on future episodes that deal with death and dying in an authentic way? Again, musicals that deal with death or dying in an authentic way. Put them in the comments or send us a message, and maybe we can do that in a future episode. Anything else, Doc?
Nope, that sounds great. I think we covered it pretty well. I mean, we
Do you
made it
have an
all the way
outro?
to your medical office visit over Zoom.
Oh my
We
goodness. And we still have to decide later if we violated the FCC of podcasts. Wait, does the FCC even deal with podcasts? I think they have bigger fish to fry.
Oh no, I don't
Um,
know. Well, but the podcast platforms all do.
oh, okay. So be warned. I'm seeing your stern. Is that the same face you give people when they reveal that their favorite lunchtime is KFC Super Bucket? And you're like, really, sir? Is that your best
Mm.
choice? Yeah. Oh, I see it. Oh my God. That's why I don't want to go to the doctor, because they always give me that face when I tell them about how much pot I smoke. But listen, I swear it's good for me. And I drive safe. But the main thing is that we all stay healthy and we don't hurt one another, and that we're loving, and turn off your devices when you're in the theater, people. Please, for God's sake. I know you don't expect the call, but come
True,
on, turn them off.
true.
Um,
Pet peeve.
Karen, this has been so much fun. I think we did well for our
It's,
first episode. If you don't have an idea of a play, just maybe tell us a comment if we're a good team on the mic. I think we're good. What do you say, Karen?
of course, I think we're great.
Well, I said good, you said great, and between that, I think that averages out to very good, which is that's very good.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Well, that was a fun ride, and I'm looking forward to more conversations in the future with Ben. As he said, we're going to talk more about theater, film, music, other topics as well. So, looking forward to having more of these fun conversations with Ben. And stay tuned. Next week, I'll be back with another interview. And until then, take care. Bye bye.